Good morning. Happy Thursday, April 21st to all of you. It is 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and we're going to get ourselves started. Thank you for attending today's webinar on Tier 2 Overview Readiness, Data Decisions and Practices. I am Jessica Swain-Bradway at Midwest PBIS, and I have the honor of introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Tim Lewis. Wanted to remind all of you that we have recorded webinars available for all to view from the School Climate Transformation Grant webinar series. We have topics like high school equity, classroom supports, training and coaching capacity. And those recordings, along with the materials, are available for download at www.pbis.org. I know Tim will remind you, but before we get started, the upcoming webinar after this webinar, the next one is going to be on school-wide screening by Mark Weiss and Kathleen. That's Kathleen Lane. That'll be another good one. That will be held May 19th, 2016, again at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Tim Lewis leading our webinar. Dr. Lewis is one of the co-directors of the National OSEP-funded PBIS Technical Assistance Center. He's been involved in special education for more than 20 years, starting with students with emotional and behavioral disabilities at high school, and elementary school, and in self-contained psychiatric settings. He is currently the Associate Dean of the Special Ed Department at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and directs the MU Center for School-Wide Positive Behavior Support, the Center for Prevention of School Violence, and several federally funded training and research projects related to social behavior. He has specialty areas in behavior disorders, developmental disabilities, applied behavior analysis, social skills instruction, positive behavior supports, early intervention. And if that's not enough, he was a main contributor to the Tier 2 development for the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, our TFI. And he's one of the leading voices in the national conversation around Tier 2 within an MTSS PBIS system. I am looking forward to listening to Dr. Lewis today. So thank you very much. Tim, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. Just some sort of organizer pieces here. You notice on your screen, you can see me. There I am. I paid a lot of money for that picture, so I use it at every opportunity I can. Also on the screen there, you see a box called Questions and Answers. Unfortunately, these webinars don't allow me to see you or you to see me, but we still want to make them as interactive and as responsive to your questions as possible. So as we go along, if you can type in your question there, what I'll do is I'll keep my eyes posted there and try to respond as we go when it sort of makes sense to fit that in the flow. In addition, right below the questions and answers box, you've got a files box. I've uploaded a couple files there. I'll also show where you can get them from the websites. But if you're interested, you can download those two documents, and I'll talk more about those as we go. The first is our Tier 2 Readiness Guide developed at the National Center, and the second is our Missouri State Tier 2 Workbook that you are free to download and use. So a little bit about what we want to try to accomplish in this hour, and realize full well an hour is not sufficient time to truly build capacity around Tier 2 supports. The logic here is to kind of walk through essential features, sort of put you on the right path, if you will, and then point you to our websites and point you to working with our collaborators and partners throughout our national center and across the states to continue to access good information. So I want to briefly review the critical features of MTSS school-wide PBS systems, spend a little bit of time talking about readiness factors on Tier 2. That was one of those hard lessons learned from our early days of doing school-wide PBS. And I clearly need to update that bio because I've actually been at this a little bit longer than Jessica provided the overview. But I'm laughing and smiling. Third, kind of talk about the critical steps to develop Tier 2 systems, once again, with an eye towards here's the big idea, now here's the direction you need to go to get additional information. Oh, somebody's asking to speak a little louder. We did lots of sound checks, but I will absolutely do that. Hopefully that's better. Irene, thank you for prompting that. third, then continue on with those steps. And then finally, just briefly talk about what do we mean by tier 2 supports? What are the range of practices that we put in place that we know that have evidence behind them? Okay. So once again, as we go, if there are questions, type those in the box. I'll keep my eyes there. In addition, I've got some polls to try to just check out who's here and kind of get a sort of sense of what's going on right now currently in your schools. So as always, you can find lots of information, more than you'll probably ever want or need, on pbis.org. We have nothing to sell today, nor do we ever. Everything we develop, your tax dollars pay for, it is on that website. In particular, as I said, under current topics, you can download that Tier 2 Readiness Guide. So I've got it on the files. You can either download it directly from this webinar, or if you're watching this on the recorded, you can go to the website and download that guide. That guide is fairly comprehensive and covers a wide range of potential readiness factors, and it was done so intentionally to make sure that it covered the landscape of all the variations that we know our states and districts are doing out there. It wasn't meant to be that you have to have every one of those factors. It was more kind of big idea. You need to look at some database decisions. You need to look at critical features. You need to look at fidelity measures and so forth. So that's available on pbis.org. In addition, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we're doing here in Missouri that I can boast about the great work my colleagues are doing. Excuse me. Our website is, like lots of others, pbismissouri.org. So the logic is PBIS, insert state, then org. And you can see right there on the school teams link, you can download Tier 2 modules and resources. So you can download our workbooks. You can download lots of tools, lots of examples, and so forth. So we really encourage folks to use not only ours, but all of our great collaborators and partners across the National Center. So let's kind of get a real quick pulse, if you will, about who is here. So if I'm doing this correctly, I've got a poll up here now, and what I've asked you to do is to quickly, some of you are veterans at this, you are all over it. Just select the button that closely approximate what your role is. Like many of you have multiple roles, which is fantastic. Okay, just to kind of get a sense, hopefully you can see that. It looks like most of you are district MTSS coordinators, which is fantastic. We've got several district administrators on board, which is also outstanding. State Department folks, yay. So we've got a nice cross-section of people in various roles, which is encouraging. So I'm hoping that's working well, and we'll end this poll now. And as I said, I'm going to ask you several of these things as we go along, but I just want to kind of get a sense of who's here. So thank you for participating in that poll. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some background information and kind of set the stage. I think it's really important, regardless of what level of implementation we're talking about, and or what issues we're talking about when we look at MTSS or school-wide PBS, and I will continue to use those interchangeably today, basically looking at building continuum supports, looking at ways to implement evidence-based practice to support all kids, from those kids who are doing well all the way up to those kids who require and need those intensive supports. Now, one of the things that you have seen us present time and time again is this series of circles. When I talk about school-wide PBS or MTSS, I really characterize it as a problem-solving framework. It's not a package, it's not a program, it's not a curriculum. It would be wonderful if we could offer you the big binder that had all the lesson plans and all the steps and strategies that you could go through, put in place in your school, and solve and address all the issues. We know that just simply doesn't work that way. This simple figure we drew well over 20, 25 years ago now, and it's continued to hold true in everything we do. When I'm out working with my schools and districts, continually say and tell them that every question you ask, my response is going to be data practice systems. By that I mean, today we're talking about tier 2 supports, right? Tier 2 people typically want to know what's the latest, greatest, what strategies, what practices. We always start, and we'll go into that in more detail as we go on this morning, with data. In other words, you need to match the practices based on the data that are presented within your school. In other words, what do your students need? How do we build those strategies that are going to be responsive? And how do we use data, particularly as we're talking about tier 2, and ways to catch kids sooner rather than later? In addition, before we spend any time investing in that practice, whether it's a simple check and check out, self-management, or some small group social skills, we also need to put in systems to progress monitor. In other words, if I'm going to ask my colleagues to invest their time and energy putting something in place, we better make sure that it's working. So data drive and guide what practices we select. We always identify data sources to progress monitor those practices. And then the third piece, and again, I realize I'm somewhat preaching to the choir today, the most essential, most critical, how do we support the adults in our school to implement these practices? One of the misrules that we've had in place in education for a very long time is that when we send kids to quote-unquote specialists, like they go down to the counselor for some small group social skills, or they meet with a special ed teacher, or they meet with the literacy person, that expert will in essence address the issues, and we don't really need to worry about what they do because they're an expert and they'll quote-unquote fix that. Well, we know from many, many years of research that simply is not going to be the case. The degree to which those practices, whether they're universal, tier 2, or tier 3, are effective is the degree to which everybody in the school understands their role in supporting and implementing that practice. So, for example, we'll talk about check and check out in a little bit here. Check and check out is effective because all the adults interact in very predictable ways across the school day with our kids who are displaying some risk and have been identifying as needing supports beyond the universal. So data practice systems. So the talk this morning is really kind of couched around those 3 steps, thinking about what systems we need to put in place, what data we need to use, and what practices that we would recommend and or that research has shown are effective for high-risk kids. Now, the other figure, and I'm not quite sure what happened to my figure here, but I will get over it. You see some the little bit of red there is bleeding in, but you've all seen this notion of the continuum. The key here, once again, is that all of these things are connected. When we're talking about tier 2 supports, we're talking about those kids in the middle, kids who are not being successful with universals alone. We need to clearly link and yoke any tier 2 strategy we put in place. We need to replicate our effective systems we built at the universal as we push up into tier 2 and tier 3. The other really important thing to bear in mind and remember as you're building your tier 2, wherever you are in this process, whether you are a veteran or whether you are thinking about putting these things in place 6 months from now, 2 years from now. One of the things that Dean Fixon has taught us that has been incredibly valuable to us is this notion that every time schools look at and consider and invest in a new level of support, they go back through this very predictable stages of implementation. So initially, all the schools on the webinar here, all the schools that you're supporting, did this exploration. Why would we do this MTSS? Why would we invest in school-wide PBIS? What's in it for us? Would it work with our students? Do we have the supports? They tried a little bit, got some outcomes, went to full implementation, became really innovative, thinking and worrying about sustainability now. When we first started working with our schools to tier 2, I remember working with them in our schools like, oh, you guys are rock stars. You got this down. Let's do tier 2. This will be a piece of cake. We'll just push in a bunch of supports. We'll add it to the MTSS team. And off we'll go. Well, it fell off. The wheels fell off in a horrible fashion. It just simply imploded. And we couldn't figure out why. It's like, wait a minute, you got this down. You know data practice systems. You know a continuum. You know the importance of teaching. What happened? Well, what happened was we forgot that they go back through the same phases of implementation. So we need to explore how many kids in our school need tier 2 supports. We need to try some initial implementation. I tell my schools, try 10 kids, try 1 grade level, start very small. because you want to make sure that you work the bugs out before you go live and try to support 30 kids or 40 kids or large numbers of kids. Because if we fail, if the system doesn't work correctly, and or we're not getting the outcomes we're after, then we start getting pushback from our colleagues, that quintessential "see, I knew this wouldn't work." So it's really important wherever you are in your implementation, as you're thinking about coming into tier 2 or even tier 3, you've got to remember your school teams are going back to square one. In addition, just like the kids, our colleagues learn through very predictable stages. So one of the things that I love to do when I have big groups of teachers in a room is I'll ask them, raise your hand if you've had at least 2 classes at the university level to teach social skills. And a smattering of hands will go up. And I say, if your hand's up, you're a special ed teacher, you're a counselor, you're a school psychologist, you're a social worker. In other words, you're probably not a general ed teacher. You're probably not an administrator. If you are and your hand's up, you're a rare bird. In other words, we simply haven't given you the skills. So you have to remember when we talk about those sort of small group social skills, and we talk about differentiated instruction, we all go through these phases of individual learning. So you've got to make sure that you map training, the professional development, the technical assistance we provide to our teams along those lines. Okay, so let's quickly go through the continuum, and then we'll take a step back and dive in much greater detail into tier 2. Critical pieces at universals. And the reason that we always go through all of the tiers in every talk we give, regardless of the topic, is because universals are always there. Universals always need to be present. Universals always need to be priority. Major steps that we've walked through at tier 1, we identify problems. We ask our school teams, what do you want kids to do instead? For every instead, you identify a specific skill that we can write in observable, measurable terms and explicitly teach. That infamous, or the matrix that everybody builds during that tier 1. That remains in place, and we need to continue to go through and update, revise. We always need a team or a section of our team paying attention to those universals. And I'll talk about the importance of that in a little bit as we go along this morning as well. Ways to teach and practice. Even apply the logic of school-wide PBIS to our responses to problem behavior. So getting away from the logic of you've done the crime, you owe the time, looking at how can we teach practice and how can we build environmental supports. Always, always, always looking at data and getting family awareness and involvement, even at that early stage. Tier 2, then, the big steps that we'll go through in more detail as we go this morning. First, we got an efficient way to identify at-risk kids. So we're going to talk a little about screening, data decision rules, and teacher referral. Big idea here is we want to identify these kids sooner rather than later. We oftentimes make the mistake of waiting too late, or our really, really good teachers hang in there way too long. We want to catch kids at the very first sign of risk, not waiting for the 35th office referral, but maybe the first or second, or maybe a series of minors that we'll talk about. We then look at the data we have in front of us from a variety of sources, right, through our office discipline referral, teacher report, and so on and so forth, and we match the intervention to what the kid needs. We're going to talk about 3 strategies, and that's it. Social skill instruction, self-management, and academic supports. We find that pretty much meets 99.9% of kids' needs, again, when we're truly talking about tier 2. And then in very bright red letters, it's got to be part of the school-wide system. It has to be linked to those universals if we want to ensure that these skills actually generalize, that kids actually use them. Tier 3 then, when kids don't respond to tier 2, or my other favorite, when the problem's intense and chronic. So I'll oftentimes do workshops with school teams, and they'll ask me, it's like, do we have to take kids through tier 1 and tier 2 before we get to tier 3? And I say, look, if you've got kids setting fires and stabbing others, go right to tier 3. I don't think check in, check out is going to help that individual child, right? So if it's intense and chronic, we go right into tier 3. But we also look at kids who aren't responding to tier 2, indicating we need to put in more supports. Here, within tier 3, we're still assuming and adopting and stressing that instructional focus. So we do FBAs, we come up with individual plans based on what that child's after, what sort of function the problem behavior serves. We're also now doing much more integrated work within mental health community agencies, although mental health should be prevalent throughout all of the tiers. Tier 1, looking at how we promote good mental health. Tier 2, looking at some of those early signs of potential mental health issues, particularly for our internalizing kids, and so forth. And then once again, in bright red letters, it's got to be linked to the universal system. So I have here an example from one of the middle schools that we've worked with, and they did a nice job because even their staff were getting confused about, okay, what team does what? And you see they've created several acronyms for their teams. So their ROCKS team is their universal. ROCKS is their expectations. Responsibility, respect, kindness, and safety. So their tag was Gentry ROCKS. So you see they meet monthly, and you kind of see what their priorities are and who's on that team. Their STAT team then was their Tier 2 team. And that was made up of core team classroom teachers. They basically developed these less intensive plans and monitored. And then their SAT process, or their Tier 3 team. So I just offer this as an example of a way to maybe illustrate and tie together all of the things that you've got going on within your school systems at present. So what I'd like to get a pulse or a read on, let me pull this poll over here again and open it. At what level would you consider the school you're in and or schools you're working with in terms of implementation of Tier 2 supports? It looks like Universal's Tier Prep coming in the lead here. It's kind of like watching a horse race. You know, we can lay bets on who's going to win. So a couple of you, it looks like you've got some Tier 2 full implementation, and a couple of you looking at even at Tier 3, which is fantastic. So welcome those who are full implementation as well as prepping Tier 3. Hopefully there's still some nuggets that you can take away. Again, it looks like most of you are in that phase where you're gearing up, getting ready to implement Tier 2, which is fantastic. This webinar then clearly is timely for you folks. So thank you for participating in that. I'm going to pull that aside and then continue on. All right, so let's talk about the three topics here. Let's talk about readiness. Let's talk about how we identify kids. And let's talk about what's the range of practices that we would recommend schools put in place as they build their Tier 2 systems, okay? First and foremost, remember that data practice systems, that applies to us as well. And people want to kind of schedule Tier 2 out based on the calendar, based on the school year, or based on, hey, we want this because we need it. But we always recommend, nope, we need to hold you back until your data indicate you are ready. So what do I mean by that? We look at several pieces of information before we bring our schools into Tier 2 training and supports. The first is that universal systems are consistently implemented with fidelity. So we look at school-wide, we look at our non-classroom. In particular, we look at classroom. If a school is not addressed classroom at this point, then we tend to hold them back. The reason being is that if we're not putting in some classroom supports, Tier 2 supports will be less effective. So we look for fidelity across the SET or the BOQ or our new tool, the TFI. BOQ SET, we look at that 80% range. TFI, it looks like about 70% are higher. So we need to make sure that we're implementing universals with fidelity before we even begin to think about Tier 2 supports. There's a question about when the PowerPoint will be available. This is being recorded. All of this stuff will be uploaded on pbis.org after the webinar. So thanks for that question. Now, I said in particular that we really need to focus and emphasize the classroom piece. And we found this out the hard way, again, thinking from, we tend to learn more from our mistakes sometimes than our successes. So we launched our Tier 2 supports. We went in, we had schools that had 80% better on the SET. They said, yes, we're ready. And what we found was very minimal success with our Tier 2 strategies because we hadn't built in the culture of trust to go in and alter and work at the classroom level. In addition, we were finding that some basic essential strategies that we know are important to help all kids be successful weren't present in the classroom. So we kind of backed up, and over the past decade or so, we're spending a lot of time making sure we address classrooms, both within our Tier 1 universals as well as that critical essential step before we get into Tier 2. So what do I mean about essential practices? Well, my team here at Missouri sort of scoured the research, scoured the literature, and basically found that these 8 strategies kept popping up time after time after time as being evidence-based, research supported, and recommended by folks who are experts in and around classroom instruction management. So these should all look very, very familiar for our schools engaging in MTSS, school-wide PBIS. Classroom expectation rules defined. Again, everybody's using school-wide, clear procedures and routines, continuum of ways to acknowledge, give feedback, and so on and so forth. Now, again, we've only got an hour. I could spend 4 days going into all of the great detail about all these. I will give you a website in a second here to show you where you can find information on all of these strategies. Okay, so here's what we've also learned around classrooms. Classroom teachers tell us, look, don't give me that 3-day in-service before school starts. I need classroom supports when I need it. And it's like, what does that mean? It means when I've tried everything and nothing's working, or when I see that I've got a disconnect between what I thought I was doing and what's going on. So at our website, pbismissouri.org, and you can see the exact web address there, we basically developed what we call these mini modules for all 8 of those essential features. So here's the idea. We've gotten away from these long 3-day workshops or going through all of the strategies. What we do instead is this. We do a brief 15-minute in-service on one skill. So during a faculty meeting, we're going to do 15 minutes on opportunities to respond. In these strategies that you can download, there are PowerPoints, there are brief videos to show examples of what it looks like. There are worksheets for teachers to use to do some planning within their class. So the idea is we're going to focus on one skill. We're going to focus on opportunities to respond for the next 3 weeks, and just opportunities to respond. Now, we know from MTSS, school-wide PBIS, everybody on this webinar today knows, it's not sufficient to tell. You have to tell, show, practice. In other words, you have to teach, and you have to practice, and you have to give feedback. That includes the adults as well. So we do the brief in-service, then we look for different ways to put performance feedback in place. We do a lot of peer coaching, right? So Jessica and I get along okay. We find a time where she can come in and watch me for 10 minutes, and I find a time to watch her for 10 minutes. The skill of the month that we learned in our faculty meeting is opportunities to respond. So I just go into her room and I count the number of opportunities to respond I see in 10 minutes. I leave that count on her desk and I go away. We don't meet, we don't debrief, I don't do evaluation. She looks at the data, she goes back to her tip sheet from the in-service and says, ooh, I'm a little low. And then she looks at ideas. Maybe I'll try some dry erase, some whiteboards. And she finds 10 minutes to do that for me. Principals, you're supposed to go through classrooms once a week, right? What if we went through during those walkthroughs and actually collected data on the skill of the week? And you see the little screenshot there on the right from the student classroom observation. We've done just that. This is a little app you can download from the App Store. I think it's $3. And we've set it up. Principals walk through, look at opportunities to respond, tap, tap, tap. They hit send. It goes to the teacher's inbox. Principal does not keep a copy. We make real clear rules that this is in order to help us get better as opposed to evaluation. So we've tried lots of different ways, but what we know is this. We can tell teachers, here's what we need to do. Teachers say, yep, I know that, I'm doing it, but I may not be doing it at the level I need to match the intensity of the challenges. Without that performance feedback, it's really difficult, right? So thinking about building classroom systems, making sure we put some kind of feedback loop in place. I want to give you just a real quick example of one of our schools, how they did this school-wide. They were, again, a school that thought, you know what, we got universals in place, we're ready for Tier 2, but we've got a lot of at-risk kids. We need to ramp up the intensity of what we're doing around Tier 1, particularly at the classroom. So in October, they screened, and they found about a third of their kids were popping up in that at-risk, high-risk. So they're thinking, okay, we don't have enough resources to address a third of our kids. Plus, what I tell schools, when your data says this, it means your universals have got to be implemented with much greater intensity than the school down the road. Universal just means everybody gets it. Doesn't mean it's the same. So what did they do? They went in and they took our 8 essential and they went in and did some observations and they interviewed teachers and they said, okay, how are we doing across all of these different strategies? And they found that encouraging expected behavior was at a very low rate. So we recommend for every corrective statement, which we have to do every now and then, we give at least 4 positive statements. So we're spending most of our time and energy focusing on what kids should do instead. They were at about 2 to 1. So for every 2 positives, they gave a corrective. So they knew, well, we've got to get this at a much higher rate, right? They also knew, since we're dealing with this number of kids at risk, again, most of the at risk came from kids in poverty, we've got to intensify all of these pieces. So what they did is they laid out kind of this professional development plan over an entire school year. So in October, initial rate was about 2 to 1. So they did some staff professional development on giving acknowledgement, positive feedback. They didn't do anything else besides the PD. Did some follow-up in February and found, well, we got a little bit better, 2.44 to 1. Still not where they needed to be. So they did more professional development, and they put in more classroom support, and they started giving performance feedback to all the teachers. And you see at the end of May, their ratio is now 7 to 1. Okay, so they spent an entire year on one skill. What did they get for that? Well, first of all, that one skill is so linked to other great universal strategies, right? If I'm looking for kids to do it correctly, I'm also prompting them. I'm giving more instruction. I'm giving more opportunities to respond, and so on and so forth. So in that year, here's what happened. They decreased ODRs by 40%, minors by 35%, and one thing we were really pleased to see, they reduced classroom minors by a third. So investing in that universal strategy, focusing on classrooms, significantly reduced the number of kids that actually needed Tier 2 supports. So that's just one example of how a school built in and addressed that classroom readiness piece. As I said, there's a lot more information on the website. In addition, we also have a really nice classroom technical assistance brief that you can download from PBIS.org that Brandy Simonson headed up, a great work group that put that together. Other readiness for Tier 2. We also want to make sure that kids are responding to what we have in place. So you've all seen the triangle, and you've all seen that range in percentages of office discipline referrals, right? So we want to make sure that kids are responding. We want to make sure that we're using data every time we meet to make decisions as well as progress monitor. So what do I mean by that? And show me an example, Tim. I know that's what you're thinking. So here you go. This is a school that got 90% on the school-wide evaluation tool. This was a school that had been doing universals for a long time. This was a school that said, we are ready for Tier 2. We've got very high-risk kids. We need to get on top of this. And the assistant principal, who was sort of chair of this team, said, hold on. Here's our data at the end of this year. We had 1,712 office referrals. We've got 57 kids with 9 or more. Where we'd expect 80% of kids to have 0 or 1, we've got 69. Right? The Tier 2 looks in range, but look at their Tier 3. We'd expect 5%, 15. What she basically said is, look, we got to ramp up our universals. And so that's what they did. In particular, they focused on classrooms. How do you get buy-in? How do you get momentum? How do we keep going? Work the problem-solving logic. We started with data. Teachers, what's your roughest time? What's the hotspot? Where are you seeing problems? We're seeing problems during these instructional conditions. Great. Let's match some of those essential features to that time. And let's build in the systems, ongoing professional development, ongoing technical assistance, focusing on those critical skills, making those a priority. What happened? Here's what happened. We didn't start any Tier 2. They basically spent an entire year ramping up their universals, particularly their classroom. And again, here's the payoff. We're now down to 16 kids with 9 or more, much more manageable. Our percentages are much more in line. We can do 10% of this school with Tier 2. We can do 7% of this school in tier 3. We've got the resources to do that. So the point here is that data drive and are so critical for the readiness piece. So looking at the fidelity of universals, in particular looking at how we built classroom supports, and also looking at our data. We're not seeing the outcomes from universals that we'd expect. That means our universals aren't implemented with the intensity. Here's a great non-example of that, right? Rub his belly, Ernie, rub his belly. A pause for all the laughter because I know what's going on. There's an old myth that if an alligator or crocodile attacks you, you rub his belly and that will lull him to sleep and he'll stop biting you. Clearly, that's not going to be an intense enough intervention to match the intensity of that crocodile eating up that boat. So the point being, just because we've got universals, just because maybe we get a pretty decent score on one of those fidelity measures, there are a whole lot of other data points we really need to look at before we're ready. Because if we go too fast, if we don't have those readiness things in place, we are not going to be successful with kids. And the last thing we want to do, as I said, is go too quick, where it then implodes and people start pushing back. So what I want to see now, pull up a poll here, get you engaged, make sure you're still out there, make sure you're still awake. How many of you are currently within your plans, within your work, putting in some classroom supports? It's completely anonymous, so I love and appreciate the honesty of folks. It's looking like most of you are getting started. Some of you have got some supports. A small handful got full implementation. Good on you, as the Aussies say. I'll let you guys see what that looks like. So it looks like the most of you are getting started, some supports in place, which is fantastic. And this is one of those areas we continue to explore. From the early days, I remember sitting at the University of Oregon with George and Rob and others, and I kept saying classroom, classroom, classroom. Yes, it's important school-wide. Yes, it's important individual kids, but it's all about the classroom. Schools are only going to be successful. Kids are only going to be successful to the degree to which we support those classroom teachers. Years ago, a friend of mine, colleague, gave me this great book, and the title of the book is "If You Don't Feed the Teachers, They'll Eat the Children." So that importance of making sure those teachers feel supported and making sure those teachers have got the resources and the tools. Simply stated, we in higher ed just don't have enough minutes with them to truly prepare them and build that fluency. Okay, so let's jump into then, we're ready. It looks like a lot of you have got those foundational pieces falling into place, which is fantastic. So what does Tier 2 look like? Well, as I said, there's kind of 3 steps. 1, we've got to come up with strategies to identify kids. 2, we've got to put interventions in place. And 3, we've got to progress monitor and evaluate, are we being effective? Are we leading outcomes? Now, as you start moving up the continuum, it's really important to remember, and it's really important to keep reminding your colleagues, look, these are learning issues. We've got to build environments to help kids be successful. In other words, as we start thinking about Tier 2 and Tier 3, a lot of times people get this reaction and we want to move it away from, right? Oh, we're just simply dealing with Jimmy, 6th generation pain in the ass. And you've got to look at the family portraits up there. I realize it feels like that with some of our kids who qualify for Tier 2 or Tier 3. But we want to get away from kind of all of those family explanations and kind of sort of setting that kid up as this is always the way it's going to be, and really approach it as, nope, we can actually get in there, intervene, and help, even Jimmy. Okay, so some of the key features of Tier 2 systems. 1, it should be centralized. Again, this is a hard lesson learned from some schools. We had a middle school that had lots of Tier 2 supports in place. They didn't have a centralized way to access those. So teachers basically were going to the people who coordinated those practices and bullying them and threatening them to take their kids. Even though the data weren't there, they're saying, nope, he's coming down and you're putting him in there. Every kid who's in a Tier 2 support, Tier 3 support should go through some kind of centralized process. The reason being, it's not just sort of Big Brother checking up, but that way we can make sure kids are a good fit with the strategy. That way we can make sure we're allocating resources in the appropriate places and so forth. Each practice then has a coordinator. So we might have a check and connect coordinator, a small group social skills coordinator. We place that kid in that support by the team. We get lots of input, but it's placed by the team. Once again, it's not a you're right, I'm wrong. It's how do we manage our resources? Classroom supports have got to be continued. And in all caps, everybody's aware of their role. So when they see that kid with that daily report, they know how to prompt and reinforce. When they know the kid in social skill group that week was focusing on the first step in anger management, which is stopping, and they see kids getting angry and they stop, they know how to use that language to reinforce that child. So step one, how do we develop ways to identify at-risk kids? We look at three strategies. First, we're increasingly becoming much skilled and much better at screening. And as Jessica prompted, our next webinar is going to focus for the entire hour on ways to screen, both academic and social emotional, to identify and flag kids. So we're doing better at screening. And one of the reasons that we're moving into more screening is because internalizing kids are just as at risk as externalizing, but they oftentimes fly under the radar. But we will catch them as we screen. Another resource on PBISmissouri.org, you can sort of search screening. What we've done is we've put this compendium together of, 45, 50 different screeners that are out there, kind of the description, the age range, if there's a cost or no cost, how long it takes, and so on and so forth. So it's not an endorsement of any of those. It's just sort of a FYI. If you're interested in screeners and you want to compare them, take a look at that document that we put together. So beyond screening, the next way to identify kids is through decision rules. We built the logic of looking at data at universals. So we look at two things. We look at majors, so those major offenses that require a kid with an administrator involvement. Equally important, we look at minors. And once again, there's no hard and fast. So schools create rules like 2 majors, 4 minors within a month, or 6 weeks, or a quarter. You guys basically take a look at your data. And here's what I do with my school team. Say, pull your data out, sort of cut a line by like majors or minors. Let's start with 2 majors. Draw a line there. Now take a look at all the kids on the side where there's 2 or more. Is there anybody missing that you think should have been in tier 2? Then we maybe do just our line. Don't overthink it. Go with it, create it, put it in place, and then we can double check. Are we letting in 2 kids or too few kids? Too many people sort of overthink and they delay. Second, I'm convinced that one of the best ways to flag appropriate kids for tier 2 is time out of instruction. So the rule I give my skills is anytime you've got to remove a child from instruction due to behavior, we need to be monitoring that. Whether we're using buddy rooms or an in-school detention room or a safe seat or whatever it is, if we're removing kids based on problem behavior, some other location outside of instruction, we need to monitor that. So here's an example from the middle school that I showed you earlier. They used buddy rooms quite a bit, and they never monitored. And what happened was the kid would misbehave, the kid would go to buddy room, the kid would sit there quietly, wait for the bell to ring, and then leave. So 1, the kid's getting out of instructional work. 2, we're not changing behavior. 3, we weren't monitoring it. So you see on the front side, you simply write the kid's name in. And no, as tempting as it is, don't pre-print these with kids' names, even though you can probably predict who might need a buddy room on a fairly regular basis. And then the important piece was the time. How many minutes? So then the kid would leave with this, and you see, what did I do wrong? They got to circle the expectation they were supposed to be following and what they're going to do different. Here's the brilliant thing they did. On the back side, they have a processing check for the teacher. So this is going to come back to the teacher. Simply sending a kid to buddy room is not sufficient. You got to problem solve what happened. In addition, they tick these boxes under what conditions it happened, and then you see the minor code they entered in Swiss. So the logic was the kid meets the decision rule if they miss 60 minutes of instruction in 2 weeks. We meet. We've got a treasure trove of data now. We know what class, we know what condition, we know what the teachers tried, and we know the nature of the challenge. That's going to put us 10 steps ahead when we try to think about what does this particular student need to be successful. So carefully mapping and monitoring anytime we remove kids from instruction. Remember, tier 2. The other thing that I should have pre-corrected, and hopefully you guys are aware of this, you got to spend a lot of time and energy letting schools know we're not talking about our heavy hitters. We're not talking about our tier 3 kids. The natural inclination is people want to put those really tough kids into some of these tier 2 supports. Might be appropriate if they're already getting tier 3, but we're not talking about the heavy hitters. We're talking about those kids. When I talk to classroom teachers, They push it 2, 3, 4 times a week, but they never cross the line. And you see teachers nod their head. It's like, yeah, I've got that kid. That's who we're talking about when we talk about tier two. And then, of course, um, teacher referrals, always an option. Teachers continue to know when something's up. Teachers continue to say, look, I'm worried about this child for this reason. So data decision rule screening, teacher referral, strategies to get kids in. Here's an example from an early childhood setting that's kind of their ways to get kids into quote unquote tier two. So you see data driven, so 4 majors, 6 minors. The team fills out the form and we meet. There's also a nomination and screening, and it follows the same logic. So I just share this as kind of an FYI in terms of even at the preschool level. We're going to follow all these procedures in terms of building good tier two supports and systems. First step is identifying kids early, not later. Okay, so we've identified a kid. They meet the decision rule. They come to the tier two team. We're looking through data. We're trying to figure out what's the best practice. Once again, don't overthink this. Match the strategy based on the challenges. I told you earlier, we look at 3 strategies that we recommend schools invest in for tier two. First is some additional social skills. So if the kid comes and it's a repeated problem and it's clearly tied to one expectation that they routinely violate, maybe they need more practice. Maybe they need more intense. Maybe they need smaller. Maybe they need additional examples. So running small group social skills. And once again, I could do 2 days on this topic alone. Big ideas here as we go. Second strategy is self-management. And we recommend a few things. At the elementary, middle school, we recommend check in, check out. Everybody calls it check in, check out, but it's really the behavior education program. And there you can see the cover from Deanna Crone, Hawken, and Horner's book. At the secondary level, we really recommend schools look into Check and Connect. You can find that online. It comes out of University of Minnesota. It's really geared at helping secondary kids both self-monitor, check in with a mentor, and problem solve so that they resolve the problems and we don't take care of it for them, right? Key on the self-management, self-monitoring, kids have some kind of way to track how they're doing. Again, here you see a elementary example where the kid basically circles yes, no, 1, 2, 3, smiley face, and so forth. And then the third strategy we encourage people to look at at tier two are academic supports. It might be the kid tripped the trigger and they came to the attention because of behavior, but we drill down and find, wow, this kid really needs academic supports. They're really struggling within academics. We're really struggling within reading or math or whatever the topic may be. So additional small group social skill, check and check out, check and connect, self-monitoring, self-management, and academic supports. Now, once again, if you're just getting started, which many of you said you are, don't take all of these on. Remember, phase implementation, look at your data, say, well, let's do check and check out. That's relatively easy to get in place. We've got the resources to do that. And let's just try it with 1 grade level. Let's just try it with 10 kids. Let the system work through. Once you get success, then start thinking, well, let's also maybe add a small group social skill. Now, what do we already have in place for academics? How can we make those more strategic in tying to one of our tier two process? So, all of these things, various schools are implementing at different levels already. It's just making them more consistent. It's tying them to the data, and it's making sure we allocate resources based on what kids need. Not, well, we've always run, lunch bunch with counselors, so let's just plop all the kids in there. They may not need additional social skills. They would benefit much more so from some instructional strategies and supports. So let's take a quick pulse. Make sure you're all awake out there. What tier two supports do you currently have in place? For those of you who are building or implementing, I realize many of you are not there yet, and that's okay. So it's looking pretty even across the board. Self-management's pulling ahead. So clearly, it's the self-management, and we find that that's fairly common. The check and check out program is pretty inexpensive in terms of time, energy, resources. Small group social skills takes a little bit more planning doing. It also takes somebody with some expertise to actually run that group and be comfortable and confident putting together 5, 6, 7, 8 kids who've demonstrated social learning errors at a pretty high rate to come to our attention, and some academic supports as well. So again, those have none, that's okay, because a lot of you I know are in that prep, and that's perfectly okay, perfectly appropriate. So thanks for that. So people can kind of see, and it's great that we've got a range going across there. Fantastic. Okay, Dave White in, all the above, great. Now, the last key piece in building Tier 2 systems of support is to carefully progress monitor the students and to evaluate our process. People always get a little edgy nervous when they think about, oh my gosh, we're going to get overwhelmed with data collection for all of these Tier 2 kids. My advice is to track Tier 2 kids using the data that brought them into the system. So if they trip the trigger around office discipline referrals, whether it's major or minor, then we track those. If it's attendance, track that. If it's time out of class, we track that. We always add an additional quick informal check-in with the teacher. How are they doing? Are you seeing changes? Why are we not? What else can we do? So you don't need to add in a whole new level of intensive kind of monitoring. The other nice thing about check and check out and check and connect is they produce a kind of de facto way to monitor, because those kids have those daily behavioral rating sheets every day, and we can enter those. In fact, if you're on Swiss, there's actually a check and check out option that you can enter and take a look at. So once again, don't overthink and don't let school teams panic about, oh my gosh, we got to collect all this additional data. No, just keep monitoring the data that brought them there. If they're on a self-management, self-monitoring, we track that. If they're small group social skills, we're going to have that instructor do just some real quick checklist on when kids master the skill. So there are very easy ways that we can put things in place. Another key thing to remember is that we want to celebrate success. So as we step back, right, so we look at data to progress monitor, is it working? If not, how can we tweak it? But also stepping back and saying, okay, we invested lots of minutes, we ran 10 kids through check and check out, did it work? And if not, why not? Right? In other words, looking at and problem solving. I remember the middle school that I've been showing the examples here today. They piloted check and check out. They shared the data of I think there were 15 kids that were pilot kids. They shared at a faculty meeting. And most kids showed decreases in office referrals. They showed improvements in attendance. They showed improvements in work completion, except for a couple. In fact, one had only a couple minor ODRs and all of a sudden had 5 majors. And it was great because nobody in that room, none of that school, none of the teachers said, see, it doesn't work for kid 13. They all started asking questions. What is going on with kid 13? What happened? Why is he responding the exact opposite way? So they started problem solving. What they found was an implementation issue. It wasn't that the kid wasn't responding. What was happening is there were a couple teachers, particularly the one teacher where we had all the office referrals, that would fill out the little rating sheet the kid would come up with, but then she'd write these mean, snarky comments in the column, right? I'll give you a 2, but I really hated your attitude today. You better clean it up, buddy. Oh, we got a major breakdown here in what we're trying to do with check and check out. Check and check out is about prompting the appropriate, acknowledging mastery. If we don't hit our target, giving encouragement and teaching, not yelling, teaching what they should do instead. So once we got that in place, we saw that kid improve immensely. And then again, thinking about a cost benefit. Did it work? Was it worth the minutes we put in place? So we've got 2 levels of data monitoring. One is, are kids performing well and improving? If not, how do we change that? Another challenge I know all schools deal with is, when do we end, right? When do we fade kids out of these things? Once again, the data will let you know. In particular, the data will let you know if you fade them too quick. So from check and check out, we go from daily, maybe twice daily, to once daily, to maybe a couple times a week, to maybe once a week, to maybe once a month, and so forth. Okay, another tool that we have out there that I would encourage you guys to take a look at as you're planning or as you're implementing, and even those who have full implementation, is using the tiered fidelity to help design as well as monitor. So again, I'm not going to go through the entire scale, but the logic here is you can take a look at the features, right? Team composition. So as we're thinking about putting together our tier 2 team, do we have somebody with behavioral expertise? Do we have somebody with administrative authority? On the screening, are we using a screening, right? Are we using our current data? Are there other ways, other strategies we can put in place? Thinking about performance data, right? Monitoring kids. Once again, are kids improving? Are we seeing that on the data? Are the percent of kids in line with what we'd expect? And then the evaluation of our overall system, okay? So these are, as I just throw these up real quickly, use that tool as well to help you think about planning as well as monitoring and problem solving if you're not getting the outcomes that you're after. So big ideas today. One, readiness, I cannot underscore enough. Don't move your school teams until they've got and hit those markers. Two, you've got to continue to pay attention to universals. You're never finished with universals, especially those classrooms. And I spent a fair amount of time on classrooms. Here in Missouri, when we launched our Tier 2, Tier 3 supports, we quickly figured out, oops, we missed a big piece, and spent the entire year doing nothing but classroom pieces and getting those schools truly ready to be receptive to those small group, those Tier 2 strategies. Thinking about that phase of implementation. Remember, you might be a rock star Tier 1, but we're going right back to that exploration. We got to give ourselves a break, start slowly, the initial implementation, work the bugs out before we go full implementation. Thinking about behavioral expertise versus job title. So I work a lot in very rural schools that say, well, we don't have a school psych, we don't have a counselor, we don't have a social worker, we don't have anybody that can teach that small group social skill. Well, you've got teachers, right? You've got librarians, you've got paraprofessionals, you've got the school secretary. We can give that person the expertise and skill set to run that group. In other words, don't let resources be a barrier to putting tier in place. If the data indicate kids could benefit, and you've identified kids who are not responding to Tier 1, we know we need Tier 2, figure out who we can provide skills. Continue that instruction focus across, even when we start moving into kids with mental health issues. Yes, we need to address that. At the same time, it's still all about teaching and practicing and providing those safe, predictable, supportive environments. And then continue to evaluate not only kid outcomes, but our overall system outcome. Okay, that's it for me. I did it within 3 minutes to spare, which is great. The next webinar, as Jessica prompt, will be on school-wide screening. So for those of you today listening to Tier 2, I would strongly encourage you to sit in on that as well. And that'll look at screening from academic all the way into more specific around mental health, setting up both Tier 2 as well as Tier 3. And that's it for me. So thank you all very much for patiently monitoring your computer screen and listening to me.